Esto está, sí, funciona fuertemente. Buenos días, good morning, everybody. Vamos a dar comienzo al panel perdón, de construcción de lo común. El título es Construction of the Common, Individual and Collective Subjectivities, Diversity and Otherness. Yo tengo una gran duda porque preparé un texto ayer, me salió un poco largo, no tan largo como Federico ayer, que fue un poco más que eso, pero tengo 9 minutos. Tengo la duda si leo eso o si simplemente presento a nuestras excelentes panelistas. Tal vez puedo empezar con algo de la lectura y veo si esto lleva mucho tiempo, lo paro ahí abruptamente.
The microphone. They can't hear.
¿Sí? Acerco el micrófono, ya está bien. Una comunidad se forma a partir de algún tipo de principio interno que, no correspondiendo a ninguna de las características naturales de sus miembros, es uno que tiene que ser ante todo realizado, producido. Si lo que llamamos comunidad remite a algo común, habría algo común a quienes tienen la potencia de producirla, que no sería solamente una especificidad que pudiera consignarse descriptivamente, ni tampoco una mera capacidad que cupiese someter a parámetros de comparación, sino otro tipo de aptitud. Si la comunidad no es algo dado, sino algo que ante todo tiene que ser producido, esa aptitud no podría sino ser
That attitude couldn't be other thing but an agency, something that the beings being part of it, something that the beings being part of it make precisely to be part of it, and over time to preserve it as well as to modify it. That agency is production, is construction of the common, and it is necessarily not any type of agency, but that one that defines the community. This will have to do with the capacity, the power to produce it as a common, but produce it as something based on something that will be common to the creatures in charge of producing it. That is not something given. At the same time, if a community needs to be formed by virtue of the agency of those who produce the common or what is produced, the production itself is a common production, and it emerges not as a mere product, but also it starts to be virtually from that agency. What's common is not only a data to be confirmed over which a community can be formed, but it's never definitely set or formed. That is, it is always in the agencies of those who have to produce it in the context of heterogeneity of those agencies. There would be the place for that identity conception of the common, according to which you belong to a community due to the identification with a set of contents, practices, values, beliefs that are shared with those who identify with those contents. This community is inclusive of those who participate of those identification processes and excluding of those who are not represented here. It is conservative in nature because it preserves what is not to be determined, remains or maintains a cohesion sense. It is indissociable in the closing from which the community is identified as such and is protected. Then it is about proposing an argument, advocating through a social principle, an authority one, a community constituted over its own opening, and it means over its rig, not a community ensured or secured, but one that is exposed. This type of community is always at stake and in conflict, and it is in the agencies of those who need to produce the common of that community. Always producing and constructing the common is what we need constitutively. Common is a hiatus, an opening, something that is a non-place, an utopus, and between. No a negativity, not a privation, a deprivation, but when you cannot make it your own because of the time you attempt to do it, it stops being that. No any authority, sovereignty can make their own common as common. The community is not the subject. You need to attribute the common property of what's common. It is not the authority acting on behalf of the collective subject community, but it has as a duty to protect it as an entity that the subject wants to adopt the name of community and declare the owner of what's common. Community is not prior to common. This is not defined by it, but there's only community from what's common. At the same time, what's common is not only prior to any individual or collective subject, but the subject is the only thing common, excluding it because of what we call subject is constituted of the exclusion of everything that is not, by having the faculty of determining what is not. The common excludes all exclusion, a measure in which it excludes all primary property, all primary appropriation. There is an original communism of what's common. Community is relation, and this is what determines that between common and owned there is irreducible proportion. Nothing immunizes against that allergy. If community is nothing but reduction is only from an entity as a fact without a starting date. It has happened from good as a being that is always something different. At all times, happening for the first time, each time, one time, it happens a between. And that happened in the hiatus, the opening, the between. It is always preceded by oneself as something other. If it is a fact, it is not always consumed, but it is excavated in itself by the memory of other happenings and agencies, opening the imminence of other happenings and agencies. This is what being open is about, the hasma, what's common. There is a relation between the common. The between is the power of the common, and thus the possibility of community, as much as that possibility in their happening, in their imminence, and in its dissolution. And I believe that is enough. So I will start reading, and I will start with the introductions of our panelists. I will start in the order we have talked about. Fatimah Tuggar, then Alejandra Castillo, and finally, then Mary Blackhouse, en los estudios centroamericanos de género.
In addition to co-creating, directing the digital story platform Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles, Maylei is currently working on rematriating historical memory and seeding indigenous social movements through the Mobile Indigenous Community Archive, MICA. A new book, Scales of Resistance, this is the new book, Scales of Resistance, Indigenous Women's Transport Organizing, draws on 23 years of research accompanying indigenous women's organizing in Mexico and its diaspora, and over 70 oral histories. She is the author of the landmark Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism in the Chicano Movement, as well as co-editor of Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Activism and Feminism in the Movement Era. She is the co-editor of the critical Latina Indigeneities special issue of Latino Studies. Alejandra Castillo es doctora en filosofía, profesora titular del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad Metropolitana de Ciencias de la Educación de Santiago, Chile, directora de la revista de cultura Papel
Magazine
Máquina,
Culture Papel Máquina, and the collection Archive Feminist is part of the advisory team of UNESCO. Some of their publications are Alter Archive, these are the most recent, Feminism Times, Revolted Images, Addict to Image, Assembly of the Bodies, Matrix, The Gender of Philosophy, Feminist Chronicles in Neoliberal Times, Philosopher, Feminist Licenses, Image, Body, and Ars Disjecta. Ars Disjecta, Figures for a Political Body 2014. Among others, of course, she currently works in the relation between images politics and feminisms under the domination of body political, is one of the main feminist thinkers, Latin American and Chilean thinkers. La artista interdisciplinar Fatimah Tuggar es una profesora asociada de
Art and Global Equity at the University of Florida. She uses dialogue and discovery among disciplines and cultures as a central art-making approach. In her work, technology is a medium and subject that serves as metaphors for power dynamics, combining objects, images, and sounds from diverse geographies and histories to comment on how technology impacts local and global realities. Her work has been exhibited in over 25 countries. She has received accolades, including a Guggenheim Creative Arts and a W.A. Mellon Research Fellowship. Her ideas and artworks have been featured in publications, including Hermas' monograph, Fatimah Tuggar, Home's Horizon. Tuggar has contributed to the global discourse in contemporary art through talks, workshops, and publications, such as 72 Assignments, the Foundation Course in Art and Design Today, and the Visual Communications Journal issue on the Ethics of Images. Esas son nuestras panelistas, y ahora entonces comenzamos con la presentación de Fatimah. Please.
I'm going to try and stand. It just feels better for me. Sorry. I want to thank the consortium and everybody involved. I'm probably going to, Andres, Aaron, Constanza is somewhere, and I'm sure there's a large team of people also that are not in the forefront that I haven't met. I'm very grateful to be here and happy that artists are included as part of the conversation in the humanities. It isn't always the case. Thank you. So the way that I'm going to talk about my presentation is that I have a couple of text-based language things to say, but predominantly I am going to be working in a way where the artwork is what leads to the ideas that I've come up with on the written material. So the artwork has to be now presented adjacent to those ideas, and it comes from my long life pursuit and practice. That's what I'm tapping into in terms of getting the ideas. So I've titled my talk, Construction of a Moving Methodology, and you can think of moving both back and forth and also the emotional sense of moving, just because I think we need to be cognizant of emotional circumstances that exist in the world. This is an artwork called Fan from 1998, and Fan combines traditional hand fans with a ceiling fan to create a new thought. And this is, the thought comes out of the context of West African urban circumstances where electricity is not stable, so we end up being we adopt to the circumstances by picking up a hand fan, and then when electricity comes back on, we turn on the ceiling fan, and there's a kind of tuggling act that goes back and forth as we modify and are modified by implements of power systems. So I wanted to sort of put a checklist based on the topic we've been given, and the checklist also mirrors some of the things that I am engaging as an artist and the concerns that I have in my work. So we must now pivot to what is meaningful and relevant to all lives. We can no longer take our planet's resilience of climate, ice caps, biomes, hydro bloodstreams, and biodiversity for granted. These conditions have unmasked chronic inequities under the surface for all who care to see. There are those who will never see, of course, because they choose not to. Global health and wealth gaps are more visible along with surveillance capitalism of rogue and divisive algorithms. The narcissistic navel-gazing of politicians who create vacuums in service. A vacuum in service is synonymous with a vacuum in leadership. And I think we have a large aspect of this going on globally with a lot of populist and fascistic leaders that are not really interested in anything other than themselves. The super wealthy are lauded as heroic philanthropists for aiding in the problems they created in the first place. This is a piece that I created in, I think it's in 2010 at Duke University Libraries. So it's a silent piece about the use of water in the city of Durham, and it looks at the utility of water, the aesthetics of water. Even though water is utilitarian, it also has this ironic aspect of it could be dangerous to us. It's used in healthcare and is aesthetic use, obviously. It also can be used in a very aesthetic and decorative way. And it has 48 monitors that change randomly with still and moving images. And then when the 8th person passes in front of the monitor, it has infrared network cameras. It shows us panoramas of misuse of water in the city of Durham. As you can see, these are some of the images of misuse. So all 48 monitors will be filled with that. It's set to 8 in 1 in terms of when it changes to pollution, because at that time the UN figures were every 8th person on the planet did not have access to clean water, so that was the significance of that in the work. So, restorative remedies. These remedies come out of my own practice as an artist, so they are really maybe not necessarily the remedies somebody else will come out with, but I think in terms of making and doing, those remedies have become what I thought would be important to share here today, and maybe we can build from there, and hopefully it's something that other people can add to. Our approach has to be collaborative and interdisciplinary, focusing on humane methodologies. We must recognize the social and personal implications of equity in cultural practices. Teaching skills and crafts must intersect with caring and empathy, framed with contextual awareness. This call for awareness should not be confused with being overly sentimental or nostalgic, or even it becoming really about the exoticization of the cultures at the margins. Presenting multiple constructive approaches will empower us to have comprehensive and inclusive solutions. And as an artist who works in an interdisciplinary fashion, that I'm not attached to any mediums or materials, that's how I arrived at this sort of approach. This approach challenges existing notions and dogmas, including our own. So we can spot biases, including our own. So I think not working within a single framework of everything has to fit in paint, everything has to fit in any single medium, I think is one of those things, or even like the fact that I do work with things that I have no idea how to make out of them. But every time I'm keeping myself honest by challenging myself to learn new things and use new materials and mediums. So I think that kind of helps you not have blind spots and in your creative approach. Intersectional approaches improve criticality and increase intolerance to ambiguity. The solutions are not in a single discipline, history, location, or individual. The conditions necessitate crossover ideas and innovations. Our solutions must mirror our multifaceted world rather than compartmentalize one of neatly packaged categories. Or we may take our cue from 1999 in Na's recipe. As you can see, Inna isn't focused on using one medium or material. She's focusing on using different histories, geographies, moments, and times in history in order for her to come up with the solution for her recipe. Of course, that is metaphorically done, but I think also the answers may not necessarily all be in new technologies in the future. Some of our solutions already exist, and this is an example of how I have chosen to look to the past as a way to innovate with the future using augmented reality and tie-dye wells in the city of Kano that from the 1700s that are still being used today, even though the difficulty of these tie-dye wells arises when younger people do not want to learn the craft or the skill. So the last generation of people are now working, the females who come up with the designs and the men who mix the chemistry of the dyes and do the dyeing could be the last people that do it because nobody else wants to do this kind of work. So I think innovating with the past might be part of where the answers are for the destruction of the planet that we've already experienced and going back to some of those things, not in a kind of romanticization of the past, certainly, but in a kind of practical doing and making with some of the ideas and innovating. So with the AR experience of this, what you see are experiences of the current, the historical, and the imaginative ideas that I've come up with. These are images of lenticular wells or dime pits that are part of the exhibition, and the lenticulars have moving and change as you revolve around them, the imagery changes. So, index of strategies that we could be using based on my tapping into my practical practice is information, checking and testing facts. So before I make anything, obviously I do a lot of research and I test and check the facts, and I think we can do that even if you're not making something by not relying on the hearsay of social media and the conformist media that is how we get a lot of the information. Application, understanding how and when to use our knowledge while thinking creatively and practically in a results-oriented manner. Human aspect, recognizing social and personal implications of issues and creating creative practice, learning about oneself, which the more we know about ourselves, probably the better we can be as community members and as global world members. Connections, integration of concepts, realms, lives, and people. Compassion, developing more empathy and contextual awareness of humanity, other life forms, and the environment. Accepting limitations, knowing when we do not know and what to do about it, knowing when to try a new approach or consider other possibilities, and when something can no longer be salvaged. This is my critique of academia, and I thought it was relevant to include that. Academia can be an incredibly violent place, and I have been on the forefront of receiving end of that, and so have many of my colleagues. This artwork is called Lives, Lies, and Learning, and in the face of the challenges of academic freedom, academic bullying, I thought I needed to make an artwork based on stories I've collected and experiences others and I have had from listening to those above us not make sense, and insisting on things that I have no idea where they come from. And these are those examples. This is a collection of real things that have happened to people in academia. that have been said. And also, I hired a bunch of actors and gave them a script, and each of them acted out this the dramatic monologues that this consists on.
As I mentioned to you before, inclusivity always leads to the exclusion of those previously included. I know about this because of, I have my PhD in philosophy. For example, one of my classes had an abundance of immigrant students in it, and they didn't really speak English very well, so I was told to work with them closely. But then that neglected the white students. So you ask how inclusivity doesn't feed into exclusion. Well, how women and people of color, their right to vote affect the white man's vote and the rights? It didn't, but I'm colorblind, so.
Yes, you keep complaining that we did not address you with your academic title as we did with everyone else, and that we keep referring to you as diversity expertise, but that is your role on the committee. The university has the mandate to have at least one person of color on every committee, so what exactly is your problem?
In the emails you two sent, you asked why you or any last senator male sexual found in the same ranking qualifications. Well, the explanation is a simple one. For women, and as such, you are paid less. The university pay equity plan was drafted in 1976, and when we recently received a draft of it, I see no reason why I should amend the document. It's a good policy. We should keep it intact.
Of course, this institution needs the tenets of academic freedom, but we must provide good customer service for our students. This is why we must have everyone teach exactly the same thing at the same time in each section. Things should be so seamless that if Tuesday, Thursday student misses class on Tuesday, they could catch up by attending a section on Wednesday and experience no difference. After all, the McDonald's burger is the same in every city. Students are products for industry, and this is the best way to prepare them for the future.
So they pop out of desks as little holograms that are about this tall. And that's how, and the desks are put at an angle, so it looks like you could literally close it and you can get them to stop. So I'm going to end on a more positive note. This is an image called Home's Horizon. And since our home is this blue planet, I have this hut to remind each and every one of us that actually what we need to survive are not multiple homes or multiple rooms. What we need for the bare necessity is maybe a bowl, a room, and some clothing and shelter. And we also need this beautiful blue planet, which is home to all of us, and we are certainly connected to one another, whether we like it or not. And so this is Home's Horizon, and is an augmented reality enabled image, the hut part. So when you hold up your phone, once you have my app, it goes to this animation. Thank you very much. Or do you want to spend? You're going to use that?
Bueno, many thanks to Fatimah Tuggar, and we step forward for the presentation of Alejandra Castillo.
Buenos días, bueno, gracias por esta invitación. Voy a presentar algo relativo a
something in relation
algo que
to
estoy trabajando, que es
something
la
I am working
cosmopolítica,
on, which
pensar
is
la
the
política desde
copolitical thinking, the politics from the body, how politics is organized and what's the body that describes.
teniendo como contexto
Having as a context
un poco, ¿no? este momento de la política
these
chilena y también latinoamericana.
times in Latin American and Chilean political where what we analyze is how how politics is organized, and then I wonder what's the body that narrates the space. Politics tells and delimits a body. Each nation visualizes and he hides. I'm not wrong when I define the politics as a luminic centricocular regime. In that sense, political philosophies of the visibility, whose intentionality first appears to be satisfied in doing visible to what is not. It wouldn't be nothing but a vision of social historiographies called to give voice to those voiceless. Both positions equally limited and faulted. Limitation and fault tied to the strong presence of identity that may presuppose. In that pretension, perspective and voice reproduce the coordinate of the regime of the light-centric, coordinates that describe from the old the space of what the common in the luminous idea, reason, and in the production of images of a passionate body. These coordinates organize an antinomic scenario to narrate, see a body. It is necessary a deviation that are only vary in the abstraction. In the removal of the organ body, the living body is visible and extension demands body. This is what philosophy says, for example, and also the stories. In their political cultural narration, it has happened from the first fictions of the anthropogenesis. The subtractive movement enabling the body visibility also subtracts the sexual difference in their multiplicity as it were in anything but the organ body, the removal of the activation of the sexual difference understood as a mere organ, flesh and fluids, whose purpose is the reproduction of the space, allows the exposure of a body whose sexual natural goals describe roles, functions, and times framed in a gender, in a heteronormed, mated, heterogeneous. It allows, in first place, the affirmation of itself and saying, yes, this body is mine, and in second place, the certainty of the identity ineffability. They look at me as the way I see myself. The information of oneself and identity are described from the possibility of the visibility. They are part of a scopic regime. We will have to add that visibility is a condition of identification. This causal relation is still clearer with the teleological transformation of visual entity. Surveillance cameras and facial recognition devices are an index of presence, visibility, and identification. And we will have to add even more the double subtraction of the body first as an organic system, and then in their sexual multiplicity allows, paradoxically, the manifestation of a body whose sex is one, and whose narration delimits the contours of a reproductive order, sexual order. The makes visible in a sex hetero-regulated implies the compliance of a mandate. The double of the identity is the guilt, where this claim teaches identity, and it is narrated from the luminic record of what's visible and follows the set of rules, acceptance of roles. Not complying with that mandate supposes a guilt act. The functions of anthropogenesis mimic the functions of those mythic religious narratives. This warns the double of identity, the mandate that implies, and the guilt it restricts, and it exposures and exhibits in a body that is announced for multiplicity. That wouldn't have to forget that the recently mentioned coordinate established hierarchies and they represent a colonial dominance, sexual, racial order. The current scopic regime of screens has not weakened those coordinates. On the contrary, it has made them even more luminic. However, the archive of the sexual difference provides them with intelligibility is falling down. As an archive, I understand the set of text, images, and technologies that define a time in their hegemonic trace. Our time, its archive is open with the possibility of the assisted reproduction. In consequence, not only the idea of affiliation has been transformed, but also our self-perception of body is altered. Part of this archive and of these times is figured in the society of the image. We shouldn't stop watching that this archive is one of the eugenics, liberal, and the one of the world and government order telematically mediated is due to this framework archive that all politic of the body, their image is under the risk of becoming a dominance order. The body is what is on the center of the calculation of the politics. If it is like that, if it is in the body itself where we allude the individual calculation, local and global, it is there where alteration politics should be articulated for this new dominance order without altering the alteration, implying a political whose politicity is fixed in the body itself. This complication is the one of time. Each production means causes their own temporality ties, subjectivities, practices, technologies in relation to the ways of working. The transit towards digital technologies and the migration of work to platforms tends to reduce temporality to a singular present. Circulation of information and images in social networks is more similar to a loop rather than a progression. The crisis of climate change contributes from other sides the certainty of the ends of the time, so perhaps there is no more time. This reduction of time to an absolute present is made evident as a turning around the body or returning to the body. When time is reduced to the experience of the daily, it doesn't seem strange the body is the place for that reduction. Symptoms are several and diverse. The valuation of the body as an individual experience, an expanded market in the care and the body vigorization, materialistic twist, trying to recover corporalities that have been forgotten from studies, analysis, and the performance as a fetish word that describe each of the actions of the subjects. From before everything is performed, and that's the complication announced previously. One of the ways where the dominion order is deployed is in the reduction of the present time to the body. How to decipher in the body the possibility of alteration of the dominion order, perhaps insisted on a body, that's true, but in a way of a corpus political, a feminist political corpus. One political of the body should be mentioned as such, like a body political or corpus political, feminist one, a political making explicit in their sentences what's been part of it, the body, in their statements. Even rather than that, it should be mentioned as a feminist body politics, where this is supposed to the conservative persistence of the gender device. Neither light or shout, neither center or magic. Different to this, looks for the visibility, hierarchies, and classifications of the dominion coordinates of the visual current political order. To have the feminist corpo political has the need to integrate in their practices accounts the other presence of forgotten struggle due to emancipation struggle activating the present itself, altering it, transforming it, and making it freedom. The feminist body politics have a paradox in their staging. Even when there is always a situated intervention, we shouldn't have to forget that a feminist body politics is always protest and complaint from a body rebelling against an unfair body. The provocation is iteration in such a way the action of a body political always precedes the action. Repetition never repeats the same. The fact of repeating a shout, a dance, a performance insists on bringing into present a movement whose origin is unknown, whose traceability is the act does not remit this. This is why repetition act is more similar to a contagion, a spread without being aware of languages, treaties, and nations. There are bodies that are affected and affect others. And this is why this moment political, which there is political, connecting one point to another in a mesh expanding and contracting. Body political is the name of multiplicity of a network connecting the absence of a predefined plan in the body political. They interpel their call is collective, and however the subjectivation they promote is particular. They start tidying bodies, names, and acts, and from this particular contagion, they start to constitute reticularly the machines against institutionals. It is precisely this origin anomaly which makes of the body politics an act of materialism, a moment of bodies that open and close in an endless frame. The body politics is spread without fixed itineraries. It is difficult to establish in which way an action affects other. We will have to insist to say that whether this is an action seeking their effects to be traced in a line whose determination is preconfigured beforehand, it aims to affect directly, and there are ways that this action continues to be divided and continues to be acting. This reverberation of the action doesn't mean to evoke effects and intentional acts. The action, which is not the action, is a stage of the body in an unforeseen context. And from before, I could say it is an action disseminated reticularly, but probably it is more important than that. It is an action disseminated in a network that starts to constitute a membrane that organizes other body. This is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandra. So now we'll go with our next presentation. Good morning. Yes, good morning. I translated my paper. So if you want to read this in Spanish, there are some copies out there at a desk. Pero la mayoría de personas hablan inglés aquí, así que voy a presentar en inglés.
First, thank you. What an honor to participate today. I want to thank Constanza and Aaron and the whole organizing team. It's been an incredible conference and a true pleasure to work here with you all. Thank you to the committee, to Amy, and to all those who put my name forward. I want to recognize the indigenous caretakers and relatives of this land, the ancestors and present and emerging generations. Whoa, this is dramatic. Okay. I also want to say I come in a good way as a Cherokee, Thai, Two-Spirit relative, and that I work and teach on unceded Tongva territory. What scales of resistance, there's no light here in this desk, so I'm like, okay, let me see if I can see in the dark. Scales of resistance is what I want to present today. Transborder Indigenous Women's Organizing is inspired by so many fellow travelers, luchadores, dreamers, and now ancestors, including Nelis Palomo, and as well as several indigenous leaders that died during COVID, Policarpo Chao, Irma Luna, and pictured here on your left, Marta Sanchez. This is an offering in honor of the world we are building together and to future generations who will inherit it. So what I want to share today is the result of my participation accompanying Indigenous women's organizing efforts for the past 23 years. It draws on 70 oral histories I conducted and more than 80 events I attended, including local, national, and transborder, transnational meetings, encuentros, marches, workshops, and shared projects. So this project's path has been guided by community-based activist research. Research undertaken this way opens a journey created by rich connections, relationships, and commitments, all of which have taken me on unforeseen paths I could have never imagined when I set out. In this way, the research processes at the center of this book are rivers that pass through and have shaped most of my adult life. I started when I was 10. No, just kidding. So I want to talk to you about weaving scale and the journey of accompaniment with Indigenous women's organizers to illustrate the ideas of interweaving scale and what I call geographies of difference in the various chapters. So Scales of Resistance shows how Indigenous women's activists developed a strategy of weaving in and between scales of power across, for example, the national, so every chapter is a different scale. The national, at the continental, transnational, and in chapter 2, the local in chapter 3, the transborder in chapter 4, and the translocal, transregional in chapter 5. So these scales of activism create new spaces of participation and new forms of consciousness, and Indigenous women's organizing conjures, reimagines, and rethinks scale. For example, in chapter 1, I've been accompanying Konami, the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women, that wove between translocal organizing and continental organizing to create a national network. In chapter 2, I look at Indigenous women's organizers from Mexico, how they help to form and build advocacy networks across Abya Yala, a concept of the Kuna people of Panama and Colombia, used by activists to name an indigenous scale of interconnection and responsibility to land. This book explores not only the ways that Indigenous rights activists scaled up their own cosmovisions to national and transnational and transborder scales, but the way they regrounded the activism and localized them into their own pueblos, municipalities, and territories in chapter 3. It then joins the migrant stream that is building translocal ways of being and belonging from Indigenous transborder scales of cultural continuity and political mobilization, binational or transborder civil society among Zapotecs, Mixtecs from Oaxaca, for example, and among members of the Latin American indigenous diaspora in chapter 5, who spatialized geographies of indigeneity on unceded territories of the Tongva Gabrielino people, which include Los Angeles and southern Channel Islands. So my research then challenges migration scholars who reproduce the settler colonial logic of terra nullius when they assume that indigenous migrants and other migrants are arriving, or they forget that they're also arriving on indigenous homelands. Throughout the insights I share here then are a collective knowledge forged through the experience of many Indigenous women activists and several generations of organizers across different communities and multiple scales. Let's see, so I'm going to talk a little bit about decolonizing scale, and I have a whole section on pre-colonial scale that I'm going to skip for the sake of time. But this is just to let you know that the book highlights the way Indigenous women organizers collaborated across scale, both those conjured by Indigenous epistemologies of land, practices of solidarity, and pluriversal conceptions of spatial relationships. The project illustrates how Indigenous women's activism in Mexico and its diaspora scales vertically up and down, but also horizontally, connecting locales, territories, and regions. I show how Indigenous women organizers interweave different types of scale that include formal political arena of Western hegemonic spaces and discourses, as well as Indigenous scales and spatial practices, knowledges, and epistemologies. So the strategic movement in and between these scales, the weaving of scales, is a form of political methodology and approach that weaves various ideologies and standpoints together, that according to Cherokee Two-Spirit scholar, poet, and playwright Quolie Driscoll, creates a third space of interwoven epistemologies. And rather than the fixed demands and strategies of identities that are scaled in one direction or another, what I found is that Indigenous women activists and social movements transverse and negotiate vastly different terrains of power, or what I have called geographies of difference. The early literature on transnational organizing kind of ignored this fact, and they talked about, movements are successful when they scale up, and then they leverage that international pressure to the national arena. But what many fail to acknowledge is that marginalized actors have to navigate relationships of power that disenfranchise them in order to scale up. And indeed, many theories of transnational organizing don't account for intersectional entrapments of power and how they're configured and exerted differently at each scale and across scales. I had to learn to be attentive to how within differential relations and flows of power that constitute network scales of activism, not only is power configured differently between each scale, but social movement actors are differentially situated by power configurations within each scale. Further, based on decades of work accompanying transnational and transborder organizers, I created the concept of geographies of difference to account for the ways transborder political actors are situated by the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, citizenship status differently, or indigeneity, the way indigeneity changes across borders. And it centers the complex and creative ways that these differently situated transborder actors navigate in and between scale. So ultimately, this book tells the story of how organized Indigenous women were able to revitalize and in some ways, and in some cases redefine their roles as women in community decision-making, create discourses that addressed women's rights within Indigenous rights frameworks. They began conversations about their own cosmovisions, their own gendered nature of social organization in their communities, leading to decolonized gender hierarchies and identities. And they would argue that Indigenous women are the heart of the family and the community structure, and therefore at the heart of Indigenous resistance and autonomy. So my work was not originally part of the spatial turn, but because Indigenous women organizers I worked with weave in and between the local, the national, the transnational, the transborder, and land-based scales of power to create these new spaces of participation, I had to decolonize social geography's concept of scale to describe how they used these nodes of power. So to give you a sense of the scope of scales of resistance included, the scales created by Indigenous women's organizing are at the local or the pueblo level, the town or village level, the municipal level, across Indigenous regions and territories that might include several pueblos, municipalities, across settler colonial juridical borders. So the book analyzes how their organizing creates scales of resistance across various conceptualizations of scale, such as settler colonial nation states and borders, geopolitical regions, such as Latin America or the Caribbean, across hemispheric, transnational, and international scales, across trans-indigenous ways of creating scale, like Abya Yala, which I'll explain more about later. Finally, the project includes transborder scales produced by the way indigenous migrants build translocal, transborder lives and politics with such a density that some scholars have called them transregions. I use the word transborder more than transnational as a way to denaturalize colonial borders and recognize that many indigenous peoples see themselves in what should be called nation-to-nation relationships rather than the ways nations try to create them as ethnic minorities. It's a colonial racial management system. So let me start with chapter 1 and share a little bit. Am I going the right way? Yes, I am. So let me illustrate a little bit about my work with the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women. I began working with them in 1997, and I was more comfortable being an activist than a researcher, and I was in my early 20s. And so I would go to events, and because I was the same age of the younger generation of organizers, I just fell in with activists like Marta Sanchez and Candida Jimenez there on the left. Schlepping beans and organizing with them. So the Chiapas uprising opened a new political spaces for indigenous women, but it increased their networking. And so they created translocal forms of organizing horizontally, but they did this through a form of consulta. So they organized across translocalities and indigenous regions within Mexico as they built their network. And they also began to weave scales of power, not only horizontally, but vertically, from the transnational or continental, which I'll talk about in a minute, to organize themselves nationally. But one of the most important things I think they did is to begin to scale down philosophical concepts and political concepts, just like the concept of indigenous autonomy. So I argue that through this process of consulta, or a kind of grassroots deliberation in social movements, they got to decide their own forms of embodiment, their own lived traditions of dress, weaving, and medicinal knowledges should be at the heart of the political concept of autonomy. The practice of autonomy they articulated at the scale of the body and the family, and it allowed indigenous women to claim their own bodily autonomy, such as the right to decide when and if to bear children and how many, whom to partner with, and how to have a life free of violence. They tied these practices to formal claims of indigenous autonomy that led to a more profound transformation of their community life and indigenous world making, and has sustained the movement, I argue, across times of demobilization and the selective neoliberal incorporation of and state violence, the state recalcitrance that recognized first indigenous rights in San Andres Peace Accord, then removed it in a counter-reform that was passed in 2001. Moreover, it's important to note that what's been called neoliberal multiculturalism allows the state to define who is a good and bad Indian, who's a good and bad indigenous subject, but they do that through gender. And so my earlier work talks about how gender is the linchpin through which people are, indigenous people are, decided as good indigenous subjects or bad ones. And so by scaling down to the intimate scales of the body, the home, the community, they've transformed indigenous autonomy from a political discourse to an embodied practice. So let me give you an example. This is part of the final declaration of the second encuentro of CONAMI in 2001. CONAMI is the Spanish acronym for the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women. We believe that autonomy of our peoples includes all areas of our lives, the home, the family, community, region, that has to do with respect and recognition for our culture, our territories, and our traditional medicine. For us, autonomy means parity, democracy, equity between men and women, indigenous and non-indigenous, between all human beings, and above all, that our rights be recognized as the original peoples we are. So as I sat in Chilpancingo, Guerrero, in Mexico in 2001, I participated in the small breakout sections with hundreds of indigenous women activists and in the plenaries of this second national gathering of indigenous women, or it was actually in 2000. I was moved by how they collectively forged a multifaceted, multiscalar concept of autonomy and illustrated this in their final declaration. although indigenous autonomy is a shared discursive and political train of struggle within the broader indigenous movement in Mexico, women activists had multiplied the meaning of autonomy beyond a right the states grants to a set of multi-scalar practices of indigenous freedom and survival that has the potential to democratize and empower indigenous women in their communities. Of course, their proposals weren't very well received, and so they created the CONAMI because they participated in both the national configurations at the time, the National Indigenous Congress and ANIPA, the second national configuration. And what a lot of people didn't realize is that they also built not just from the bottom up, but from the top down, from the continental movement, because many people had attended the Continental Network of Indigenous Women meetings, and because Mexico was to host the second continental meeting, they began to form a national network to hold that space. So just as weaving up and down and across scale is important to how organized indigenous women in Mexico use the momentum of local movements to build a national network within the indigenous movement, and even to demand women's formal leadership in national organizations, I also started to understand the importance and efficacy of being able to scale not just up and down, but across various kinds of scale, connecting the formal political arena across specifically gendered bodies, for example, and contrasting colonial divisions of scale itself to indigenous conceptions of scale, space, solidarity, and connection, which I talk about in chapter 2, which details how the indigenous women activists from Mexico traveled to participate in the 1994 Latin American and Caribbean Regional Preparatory Meeting for the 4th UN meeting on women in Beijing. What they found immediately was stark power differentials, and at the heart of the concept of geographies of difference was how they had to overcome their own marginalization as indigenous women, not only at the national level, but then with mestiza feminists at the continental level, when they realized the kind of racism and maternalism and exclusion that the mestiza feminist organizers showed them. So they heeded the call of the Cuna land episteme of Abya Yala. Indigenous women activists conjured an indigenous scale of connection, solidarity, and responsibility throughout the hemisphere through their organizing. They created an alternative scale. So instead of participating in the feminist continental network, they created their own scale of action and centered their own knowledges, needs, and cosmovisions. They used this indigenous scale of Abya Yala to generate their own alternative form of connection and organizing, and to counter colonial, regional, hemispheric, and continental names and knowledges, and political formations that meant to eliminate them and their communities as indigenous people. Because as we know, the Latin and the word American are both colonial projects of empire. One's maintained usually against British Empire. So this was kind of names in forms of different forms of colonial empires. But as Anna Singh shows us, she calls attention to the important ways scales are produced by global capital and by colonialism, and how they produce friction and how scales can fail. So what's interesting to me in chapter 2 is that how indigenous women's activists learn to tie off threads when their projects, visions, and epistemologies reveal to be unscalable. So while ECMIA was founded as the Enlace Continental, or the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of Abya Yala, they eventually found that the word Abya Yala was unscalable to both enter and resonate with the international system and to encompass the great diversity of indigenous women from Canada to Tierra del Fuego. Through indigenous women's organizing, and they changed their name to what is now the Americas, because Abya Yala for them didn't scale in the same way. And so what I realized is this is a form of interweaving, because you could see that as a failure, but really what's going on is it builds on a kind of indigenous theorizing that Marta Sanchez herself, a Musco activist and founding member of CONAMI, calls the doble mirada. And Gloria Chacon theorizes it's the Caba wheel strategies of indigenous women's activism that moves between indigenous knowledge systems, scales, and shared political projects, and dominant Western systems and scales to form a double weave. Exactly what I mentioned at the beginning with Two-Spirit Cherokee scholar Quoli Driscoll uses the metaphor of the Cherokee double woven basket. It has one face on the outside and another face on the inside, but it has stints in between. And they theorize this as the Cherokee double weave basket is woven with river cane, and that's the metaphor for them to talk about queer and indigenous knowledges and their Asegi theory. But when double woven, it's important to think about this new interwoven epistemology. We could also recall that important theorists of women's social movements in the region, like Sonia Alvarez, already had talked about this policy advocacy and an identity solidarity logic, two different logics. And so I started to look at how indigenous women were interweaving these logics to contest both Western hegemonic feminism that centers forms of and that decenters forms of indigenous struggle and indigenous women's struggle, and how indigenous women began to decolonize their own concepts of gender and sexuality, which are colonially imposed, like a gender binary, et cetera. But they are also grounded in their own communal struggle and within their own families and communities, not outside of them. So this lived, embodied solidarity reminds us that we're connected to our feet. We're all connected to wherever our feet touch the earth, and that well-being of all women is interrelated to the well-being of all people, the earth, and other beings or relatives, as indigenous people see them, for the most part. So indigenous women's organizing across Abya Yala has inspired also new indigenous theories and practices of feminism. Even what's called hegemonic feminism in the region has been pushed to incorporate a decolonial stance. So I'm gonna go a little faster here. Oops, I forgot to, sorry. You needed that slide a while ago. While you look at this one, I'm gonna start to tell you about chapter 3. So in chapter 3, I go back to how some of the women started to apply these experiences in the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca, first, and Jalisco. They built statewide networks. Women started to lead the community police, right? That's been really highly effective in pushing out narco-trafficking in their regions. But I really focused in this last chapter, or in this chapter 3, on how indigenous women scaled down these concepts they had gotten nationally and transnationally into labor and dignity by scaling down these concepts in community care and economic well-being in their homes, in their gardens, literally, in the milpa, and communities and municipalities. So that chapter, this is the CONAMI, the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas. This is, okay, wait, I think I have more slides here. This is one of the last ones in Guatemala. This is an interesting photo because it has leaders from the north on the right with Rigoberto Menchú. In the middle is Chief Colleen Sisk of the Winneman Wintu, and there's a Chicana Indígena representative, and folks, of course, from this region, from the Southern Cone. But this is the example of the interweaving of knowledge. One of the conferences was held in the rooms that were named after various colonizers, conquerors. And so the former Hernan Cortez room was renamed. The former Pizarro room was called Itza. Quetzali was named for the Juan Ponce de Leon room. And this, of course, then you could check out the Wi-Fi codes underneath, right? So this is how each space was reconfigured by indigenous knowledges. Okay, this is a longer part that I'm not gonna show, but basically how indigenous women had to organize after many different racist encounters at Latin American Feminist Encuentros. This is us writing the statement. And this is in 2005 in Brazil, the first indigenous caucus that formed simultaneously, just, you know, because of the racism we encountered. So this is folks getting ready to read that statement. And then it didn't get better. In Mexico, we got there, it was the biggest indigenous contingent at any Latin American feminist encuentro, this was the stage. It looked like a stage of a talk show, and this is the space Indigenous women got. Like, there was no lighting, there was no amplification, and so people are trying to shout. And of course, you can see it's the biggest breakout section there was. And this is people are pissed. They're reading yet another statement. So I think people have kind of evacuated, trying to make that a space. So here's more fun pictures. Okay, let me get to this, which is chapter 3. So in 3, I started to look at reworking ideas of gender comunalidad. So comunalidad is a concept of Mixtec and Zapotec communal labor. So citizenship, many of you may know that citizenship is not just given because you're born somewhere, it's earned through labor, collective labor. But often it's conceptualized through male labor. And when women are given those cargos and those roles, they're like, okay, I'm already working in my family, and then I'm working full time, and I already do communal labor that's unrecognized. Now you want me to do this other labor. So it's like 4 different kinds of labor. So I start to think about how Western feminism has classically centered the individual, political rights, to the exclusion of collective cultural and economic rights, which produce seeming contradictions for Indigenous women's activism within their own Indigenous municipalities. So I followed the story, and this is, 3 oral histories, maybe over 20 years, of Sofia Robles, who conceptualizes women's empowerment through the idea of logros, or achievements or successes that expand a Western framework of women's rights in order to ground Indigenous women in the long history for struggle of inclusion within their own community. So instead of working with the state-down imposition, right, the state has imposed gender equity schemes, I focus on how Indigenous women built from the ground up, from the grassroots up, by engendering comunalidad, right? So when I interviewed Sofia, I asked, so how did you feel when you first got the bastón de mando? And she's like, I was exhausted because I had to stay up all night to make tamales, right? And if she had had a female relative or a wife, she wouldn't have had to do that, but she had to do that communal reproductive labor as well as this other labor. So I start to think about gendering the notion of comunalidad, but also to think about how Indigenous women are building forms of their own empowerment in Indigenous municipalities. And it's a big state project to portray, of course, Indigenous people as the most sexist, as if mestizos are not sexist, et cetera. So this chapter really pushes back on how Indigenous women are building their own forms of empowerment and their own local network. So this is the Mihe call themselves the Ayuk. So this is the Ayuk Indigenous Women's Network that are built across the municipality of Ayuk municipality. So just to share a little bit more, the next chapter goes through the transnational or transborder organizing, or the trans-region, which I argue is a scale conjured by Indigenous mobility and Indigenous community making and political organizing. Organizing across Indigenous trans-regions ties together multi-local nodes of the Oaxacan Indigenous diaspora. So even though I started working with the national movement in Mexico, by the time I moved to UCLA, maybe 18 years ago, the FIOB asked me to work with them and serve as an advisor, and we did this project in LA. So this is in LA, and I can tell you more about it in the Q&A if you're interested, but we did a study that was led by the organization. We presented it here. I'm sitting in the corner like a good, note taker, and they presented the results, and it led to Indigenous women's leadership schools and youth leadership schools that changed the face of the FIOB, that had a lot of women-led organizations after that, and a lot of conflict as well. So it wasn't an easy ride, but what that chapter figures out is, even though Indigenous people are the same social subject on both sides of the border, how indigeneity is configured is different on each side. And so there was a lot of work to do with decolonizing one's identity in the side of the US and organizing for, popular grassroots economics and the multiple scales of grassroots leadership for Indigenous women. The last chapter lands here in LA, and this is a map of LA, which most LA people know the spatial orientation of LA based on freeways, but this has the Tongva traditional villages also shown. So to show that indigenous people are in fact still here. But Tongva Gabrieleño people are not federally recognized. And so there's multiple layers of indigeneity in Los Angeles, right? The Tongva Gabrieleño, the federally recognized relocated American Indian community, which I form part of, and the migrant indigenous communities coming from the Latin American indigenous diaspora and the diaspora from Oceania. So it's really complicated, but I'm trying to theorize what happens when indigenous migrants land on indigenous land. And so we're starting to theorize multiple colonialities, right? Because of course, California was colonized by Spain first, then Mexico, then the settler colonial project of California lays on top of those two other colonial foundations. And so this talks about how the spatial orientation of Los Angeles is being reoriented through geographies of indigeneity. So if you see the big ascending regions are the Mixteca, they're in yellow, and the Valles Centrales, and the Sierra Norte, the yellow and the green. These are being mapped on two different neighborhoods of LA, where in the central region is the Northern Sierra, and on the west side is the Valles Centrales, or the Central Valleys. So these geographies of Oaxaca are being mapped into the geographies of neighborhoods in LA, and whole pueblos are moving to LA. There's 250,000 Zapotecs just living in LA County. There's 60,000 Mayas in LA County. And so this is part of the Mapping Indigenous LA. I did the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora. So you can see people are keeping the tradition. So they're changing, this maps the sound waves, through the 26 different Philharmonic bands of Zapotec diaspora, and dancing and foodways, of course, street food, etc., and restaurants. The James Beard Award was given to the Galaguetza restaurant. This is the Mapping Indigenous LA project. It's an ArcGIS digital storytelling project. That led me to work with colleagues to theorize this kind of multiple colonialities through critical Latinx indigeneity, right? That this indigenous migration is rechanging what Latino means and what Indian means in LA and across the US. And so this project has been really important in helping me think about how hegemonies of racial power migrate with migrants and meet a US white supremacist system, but these systems collide and then hybridize. So I started to first think about this with farm workers, where women would have to navigate how an anti-Indian hatred was manifest by mestizo foremen, but organized through labor segmentation that aligned with white supremacy. So how two different racial systems are hybridizing. So I've been working with colleagues in that critical Latinx indigeneity. And I don't have time to share the coda, which is on the subterranean life of seeds, but I want to share just in closing the mobile indigenous community archive that I've been building. And the project is conceptualized as a seed bank of social movement knowledge, and the goal is to rematriate that knowledge back into the movements that born them. So, of course, I started with the, 70 oral histories that I'm starting to put up and negotiate with people how much they want there. But as I began to build mine, I built with the activists, and they started to put their collections. So these are archives that are owned by both the FIOB and CONAMI, and they're using them to build, popular education materials in the case of the FIOB. Because their membership is largely farm workers, mixed. So I should say, I think 30% of all farm workers in California are Oaxacan indigenous migrants, largely Mixtec and Triqui. And the CONAMI, we just met with them last week, so we haven't launched it publicly, but if you look at mica.ucla.edu, you will find this is the archive we are building, and they're starting to build their own histories of the organization in Spanish, and then we're starting this summer to do the narration. We'll do the first narration in Ñañú. Margarita is going to do that. So it's really exciting. We're going to do an exhibition of Martha Sanchez's life, etc. So these are some of the projects. This is I can tell you the nightmares of Murkutu that I've experienced, because this is a archive where the movement itself is trying to be the archivist, and so that's a whole thing. So I just want to say thank you, and yeah, it's been amazing to talk with you.
Ahora abrimos, tenemos 15 minutos para preguntas y comentarios, lo que a ustedes les parezca más oportuno respecto de esta presentación.
About these presentations. We're talking about arts, epistemology, feminism. It is quite provocative. So this is open for, the floor is open for you all. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you, Fatimah, Alejandra, Pablo. My question is mainly for Alejandra. I've been lucky enough to read her books, not all of them, but some of them. And could you please go deeper into, when you talk about these production models through time that has a singular temporality, somehow it is based in the corpus politics that this feminist body has. There's a multiplicity that tries to create something quite special. I wanted to ask you, this production model, how could it be understood from the division of time and also space? Basically that. Difficult question, time and space. When we were working this issue, this problem of corporate policies, politics, talking about temporality, in the context of the social networks, the image in social networks, sometimes it triggers some present time. It is absolutely, which has been described accurately from the history theory. François Tuggar mentions that the present temporality seems to be described from this present, which is absolute, where the subject it is made out of in that temporary space. So there the question is how some other archives are organized in order to question or alter this order, which is telematic. It is a domain order which is described from an order which is teletechnological, and it creates some subjectivities, where each contributes in this subjective contribution. Peoples are getting connected through different platforms, TikTok and some others, where the subject is visualized and seen, and he shows himself, and we can see this order, ocular-centric order. So therefore, there's some hope that was in this post-structuralism. Let's think about the 60s and 70s, where they thought there would be a decline of this view. There were some way of questioning the order of domain. A scopic one. Nevertheless, it's seen reinforced from, today, right? And therefore, that alteration hope, we may also see it in Latin America under the figure of Neo-Barroco, that multiplicity of shapes and how to intervene the space of the common, placing or altering the order of the viewpoint or perspective. So there we're finding a context where some of the hopes, theoretical and political and practical hopes in the transformation policy of this coordinate of the transformation, political one, somehow are struggling or being faced by this day-to-day transformation through images where coordinates are the present time. and the identity itself, though the alterations are the subjects. So there's a fiction of alteration, but nevertheless there's an order of identity which it's been somehow humanizing this figure of the facial control, face control. It is, there's an alter ego with some filters, but there is, I don't know, some fixation of this control. So that is the context on how to think of a transformation of the politics from the body, where we think of the alteration of these coordinates, which sometimes, are getting rigid in this technological modification from the body, which is the place where we can also think that we're reproducing the domain order. Precisely there, it's in the body that where that happens. And once again, I'm coming back to this space of the social networks and that image. The figure, for instance, that, we see oftentimes, and quite clearly, the displacement of this device, democratic device, connected to the rights and the access, which is done through education in the 20th century and starts in the 19th century, and is also connected to some order of development. We need to wonder, if it is possible to, that device in from the 19th century articulated for development, well-being, welfare, and energy, which comes from the 19th century and was developed through in the 20th century. Now it is under transformation, or it is in a crisis. So therefore, we also have this idea of the possibility of integration through images, where the body itself can organize the order of this gain or development. For instance, influencers, urban music, where it seems you don't really need any talent, you don't really need to go through these studies in order to enter to this space of welfare that was promised by the city and the development coming from the 19th century. So why do we need to go through that? It is slow, it is elitist, so we better do this, where it is not necessary to have a pedagogical device where the body itself, it is the one that somehow shows this order of the possibility. So once again, it is the body where we are having this integration. And it is also connected to something which is really interesting and really complex, luxury. The figure of, in urban music, how they socialize an idea of luxury, which is accessible, facing this other paradigm, which is not reachable or not desirable, the paradigm of the democratic paradigm of rights, for instance. And there you have the body. And the question is, how can we think now? What is the body thought of? Feminism in Latin America concentrates there in transformation policy, but in order to locate it there, we need to transform the order of temporality. Not present, we need to activate some other times and some other archives. So there you have the figure of Benjamin, when he teaches that how to think about it, how to think about that order of this revolt. But Benjamin, nevertheless, was not thinking that from that body, which is not the anthrocentric body, which reproduces the order of philosophy. Philosophy reproduces an order which is anthrocentric. So when I think of atemporality, I think about it there, in that connection, in that space, time, other archives, in order to think in other times and some other places, but also displacing the order of the androcentric. So that answer, which we believe it is quite comfortable and fast and easy and simple, it's something that Benjamin said, the ones who have been defeated. Anyways, we need to decenter the center of those archives, which also reproduce a sign which is androcentric. And that archive of the revolt that we acknowledge, we need to decentralize it. We need to read it differently. First, explaining the androcentric male body. I don't know if you have read this, but there are some biographies by Benjamin they said he was chauvinist. Yes, he must have been, because he had a relationship where he was the boss over her partners. But the question is how philosophy, when you describe it from an order which wants alteration, still reproduces an androcentric order, not only the attitude of the subjects, but how the writings and the text, the archive itself, for example, the temporality problem in Benjamin, though he wants to alter that linear order of the there, it reproduces a body which is androcentric. So that is my question. How do we alter the archives of the revolt? And we acknowledge them as a revolt, which are placed there. There's a double temporality, present and an archive, which is before, in order to transform the body. The politics of the body, having this a domain order by images. Vamos a recabar preguntas. Primero, Ana. Muchas gracias. My question is for Maylei. Can you please connect a little bit these two parts of your lecture, the different scales in which you have observed that these communities are working on, with the second half, with these archives and files, how archives can also be thought from different scales. And in your experience, I mean, you're creating an archive. How did you do it? And please, what did you mean by, or what is the mobile part of the archive, which was shown at the beginning? Thank you. Kathy, de la universidad. Universidad.
Seattle. Thank you so much. I'm really in admiration of the interventions and the contributions that you've made, a very, very rich panel. I'm going to ask if you could think about whether the concept of generation could be useful in further elaborating how you have been thinking. Generation might be a potential opening for the creation of community in some of your cases. I'm thinking, Alejandra, of how generation might help us think further about what it means for the body to be the point of reduction of time. How can time be expanded and is expanded through the body, and how generations relate to one another. I'm thinking, too, in terms of the geopolitical as a scale, but generation was also present in your contribution, literally in the photographs that we saw, and the fact that you've been conducting this research for 20 years, which is magnificent. And then finally, Fatimah, I'm wondering if generation might be present in your last piece of work, or how you might think of it in the last piece that you showed us, which had very, very much to do with the academy and the university and how violent it can be. In this case, generations might not be an opening to community, but might be something other.
I always have to cough when I take the mic, clear my throat. So I don't really have a question about content. I just have an observation about sort of Maylei and Fatimah, your projects, and it's that there's like a similarity in kind of method and critical practice in both of your cases. Both of your projects depend upon a kind of, actually, I think kind of echoing Kathy, like the location of the subject or the dislocation of the subject. In terms of Fatimah, you sort of talk about how putting yourself in new media is sort of generative or sort of alienating, like I think in the I feel like your PowerPoint slides felt a little bit like I was taking an eye exam, so I couldn't quite see what you. So, but I remember you said something about our own biases, like putting yourself in new media, sort of makes you aware of your own biases, and Maylei, like the sense of like constantly shifting scale for like the framework of your analysis. I just sort of was more interested to see how you respond to each other's projects, or what you were thinking about, and like looking at or just sort of. I wanted to hear you two talk to one another more than anything. So I guess it's not a question, but more wanting a sort of dialogue on the panel of sort of what you saw generated sort of between those projects.
We have two more.
A very simple question for Maylei. In terms of the conversation that we had with our colleague Mapuches that were here, and how that inter-American conversation that you've been engaged with has or has not have a presence here in this region, and what are some of the possibilities in terms of the continuation of that conversation, as we were talking about after the panel the other day. And anyway, that's just kind of, how do we sort of continue creating these solidarity networks that are pretty much sometimes, as you mentioned, based on place, but also on local resource, in the way that local resources are being mismanaged or managed, and also the political needs of some of these communities in terms of these saberes que están por todas partes, ¿no? ¿Qué sería eso?
Very briefly, this is a question for Fatimah. I loved that opening image of the fan and how you talked about toggling, and that toggling, as well as the movement, is woven throughout your work, where the viewer has to toggle between being the 7/8 or the 1/8 and on throughout your work. So I'm curious about how theoretically that concept of toggling puts the viewer on the spot, forces them to engage, and how that may be emerging in your future work.
Digital archive towards an indigenous and multiple indigenous practices. So both organizations I work with are networks with multiple indigenous communities and organizations in it. And so that's the mobile part. It's on the mobile phone. It has mobile upload. It has ways in which you can upload it mobily, because there's no central location for either. One's a diasporic community. And one is a national community that has no central office. So yeah, everything, and that's somewhat of the nightmare for content management systems, is that one, they're not in Spanish. Two, it's a participant-driven archive. And so like trying to make it, the interface, able to interface on a mobile phone by farm workers. So we would do like viewing parties together to develop metadata. And so, you know, it's mobile memory, it's diasporic, it's because it's networks that cross such a large territory. One of the remaking of scale by the Mexican indigenous movement is they broke from the northern network and decided Mexico was its own region within the Enlace Continental. They just decided they didn't really believe they were part of North America with US and Canada, so they created their own region. So I think generation is a brilliant way to think about political generation. And I also have a piece that I published after this book on multiple temporalities of indigenous bodies and indigenous knowledge, that indigenous women hold multiple temporalities in their body because colonial time sees indigenous people in the past, right? And so their presentation as quote unquote modern women hold those multiple temporalities that are often expressed through women's labor, like using the metate or using traditional cooking, which is based all on Mexican tourism, is based on the temporality of indigenous women's labor and bodies, as in the past, like recovering, come eat the mole of Oaxaca, or come experience this past time that's embodied through indigenous women. And I do see with Fatimah the scale shifts. We have similar shifting between the fan and the body and the room, and the interweaving of indigenous knowledge in your presentation, and indigenous knowledge and technical knowledge. I see some of the same moves as well, ancestral. And in terms of the last question in the Mapuche, it's a very shared sense of framework and claim, right? They're trying to, they themselves are in national, international, and trans-indigenous networks, and they're also trying to pressure their national government to recognize them in the Constitution, et cetera. But I think they're also talking about, like, they managed to talk about the 70% of all biodiversity is managed by indigenous people. And so there's the scale of the earth, and they're grounding it back into the interconnection of beings and relations, water, trees, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of important trans-indigenous scales that are being shared in that as well. And the networks do happen, and they're continuing to happen. So it's amazing to see them. What's new is that they're in institutional or university spaces. And so I think that's the thing we have to encourage and continue. So I'll pass it because I know we're running out. You gotta pull the mic.
So with regards to the first question about generation, I'm not sure I actually fully understand that question, but I'm gonna answer it probably in this way. Similar to the fact that I straddle cultures, I think, and that is probably evident in the body of work, which we've seen a tiny bit of. It's not a small project, it's a lifelong, ongoing pursuit. So that I have I'm now 3 decades into my career. I think that I straddle also generations, in the sense that I am using technologies that may be considered not necessarily of the generation I started out with. So I think that is part of the conversation of having to think in a cross and interdisciplinary and intergeographical way that is necessary, I think, for where we're headed, and bringing along the past with along with us to the future. The question of bias and putting myself in the medium is not that I am personally in the medium, but for the life of a maker, I am constantly using different materials. And so as a collagist, somebody who works with existing mediums and materials, I think there is a way that when you're doing something with things you have never used before, that you're not stagnated. So for example, if I used painting, every expression and everything I ever think about has to fit in a single material. It has to be a sculpture, it has to be a painting. Then I think there's a way that I just become overly comfortable. And I think keeping myself on my toes is part of a way of engaging with a certain level of challenge and questioning my own biases, questioning my own blind spots, while as if I was just using the same material over and over. I'm always like painting something and then that's it. I think it's limiting. So the fact that I work in a way where the ideas drive whatever the material and the medium is going to be is pretty much what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the blind spots. Toggling and putting the viewer in, so yes, I would agree that there is an ongoing dislocation, toggling, moving back and forth, and repositioning myself or even the viewer within the context of the work. There are other works we haven't looked at where the viewer becomes the collagist and I relinquish my role as more the maker, but putting other people in the position where they're more the creative makers. So I do that, I think, as a way of trying to create works where they're community-based or they are more engaging the viewer's own creativity and thinking, which I think is necessary and definitely is something I intend to continue to do as I move forward because of the commitment that I've made to this notion of interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think I literally need to live that through the work. So that's part of it. I don't know if I answered the question, but you know, whenever we leave also I can converse with people individually. Thank you.
So, creo que estamos terminando este panel. Please join me to thank Fatimah, Alejandra, and Maylei for this wonderful panel.